Greetings, story lovers. This is Isabel. We continue with the romance collection. Here is Peacock Feathers by Temple Bailey, Chapter 2. 1. I learned in those first days in New Haven that I was not like most of the other students. I had come from simple people whose social horizon was bounded on one side by the 10 Commandments and on the other by my father's black coat. At Yale, many of the men I met had been prepared at private schools and had inherited traditions of family importance. There were others, too, who were rich and without traditions, but all of them had something that I did not have, a sort of sophistication which made me feel an outsider. Their attitude towards me was, I decided, somewhat like my own attitude toward the European immigrants in our town. They went their way, and I went mine. And I was conscious always of my awkwardness, my lack of manner, the archaic quality of my ideals. I was to know later that I had misjudged my classmates, that I might have won response had I been less self-conscious, but at the time I thought them snobs, and I kept to myself, watching them, however, with eager eyes, and wishing that I were like them. I shall pass quickly over my first 3 years at college. The history of them is not different, I fancy, from that of any boy who finds himself in an utterly new environment and has to adjust himself to it. I did some foolish things, and perhaps some wise ones. I loved books, so that in my studies I satisfied certain of my teachers, and I had great physical strength and endurance, which brought me conspicuously to the front in athletics. Yet I had always that feeling of being an outsider, until in my senior year I made a friend who changed the world for me. His name was Lionel Clark, and he lived in St. Louis. I had first been attracted to him when a theme of his was read in a class. It was a short sketch of fur trading in the early Middle West, and his pen had caught all the color and movement of the days when the Mississippi was a great highway. He wrote of trappers and priests, of Indians and of French gallants, of gay ladies transported from all the luxuries of aristocratic society to rough and primitive surroundings, yet losing none of their elegance or insouciance in the process. I walked beside him as we left the room. "That was a dandy write-up," I told him. "Is it all true?" I had never spoken to him before. He was a dark, thin-faced lad with a cool, bright glance and an ease of manner which marked him as one of the inner circle from which I was shut out. But he did not shut me out. He answered with a quick smile and a turn of his head towards me. "Of course it's true. You Easterners seem to have an idea that all the romance of the world is in your Boston Tea Party or in Pocahontas. But we've got it out there." "Daniel Boone?" He shook his head. "He is spectacular, of course, but there was an early social background which was unique. My great-grandmother carried her ball gown of yellow brocade in a bandbox on my great-grandfather's first voyage up to the Mississippi, and she wore it later to welcome Lafayette. My own grandmothers had never known ball gowns. In their pioneer days, they had aspired to nothing finer than a Sunday best of wool in the winter or print in summer. And I am sure that none of them had ever danced with Lafayette. My imagination was fired. "Why don't you write a book about it?" "That's what I want to do. I have a chapter or two on paper." We parted after a few moments, but I was thrilled by the encounter. The fact that he was from St. Louis drew about him a magic circle. I had wanted to ask him if he knew Mimi Lebrun. I felt that even if he did not, he at least knew the places which her presence brightened. He walked on the same streets, entered the same houses. The time came when I spoke to him again of something he had written for the college paper. He liked my praise, and my interest, I think, flattered him. He offered to read to me the chapters of his book. "Come over to my rooms tonight." His rooms were charming, and I thought he must have a great deal of money. I was to learn, however, that his means were moderate. I was impressed by the fact that his belongings, while the best of their kind, gave an effect of exquisite simplicity. Nothing was cluttered up. But he had good books, deep, comfortable chairs, a lamp whose base was a vase of old Chinese pottery with a shade of translucent silk showing shadowy Chinese figures. He told me later that his grandfather had furnished his rooms and had given him an allowance, and it was then I found that his grandfather was the senator from Missouri, whom I had observed so often in Washington. It is needless to say that the news thrilled me. "Do you know Mimi Lebrun?" I demanded. His surprise was apparent. "She's my cousin. Have you met her?" I flushed. "I saw her once in Washington, and I heard your grandfather speak." "He's dead, you know." I had read that in the papers. I wanted to ask more about Mimi Lebrun, but Lionel was keen to get at his story. So I sat in one of the big chairs and listened, much uplifted by the fact of my new acquaintance and his easy acceptance of my friendship. There was a table well back in the corner of the room, and on this table was a photograph in a standing silver frame. I found my eyes gradually focusing upon it. It showed a girl in a dancing frock and floating ribbons. Her pose was unaffected, charming. I seemed to recognize her, and I felt the blood leap in my veins. When Lionel finished his story, I praised it. He glowed under my praise. He was, I discovered as I knew him better, always dependent on the opinion of others. He touched the skies or descended to the depths as he was commended or criticized. In later years, his clipping bureau kept him alternating between despair and ecstasy. It was, I think, because of my honest admiration of his attainments that he liked to have me near him, and I am sure I was a spur to his increased activities. Tonight he opened his heart, told me of his ambition. His grandfather's death had left him practically without means. His father was living, but was, I gathered, a gentleman of somewhat elegant leisure. After mother's death, everybody thought grandfather's money would come to Mimi and me. But just a year ago he married a second wife and left his fortune to her. I think he meant that she should do things for us, but she hasn't. It was, he explained, much harder for him than for a man who had had no expectations. "We have a social position to keep up. Grandfather always made mother an allowance, and Mimi's mother. It leaves us in a deuce of a hole. That's why I want to write books. It is one way to make money, and I think I have a flair for it." So he talked on, and I listened and sympathized, but all the while I was consumed with a desire to see that shadowy photograph at closer range. "In a way," Lionel was saying, "it will be harder for Mimi than for me. She must make her debut next winter, and heaven only knows where she'll get her gowns." I had never known girls who were presented to society. I stole another look at Mimi Lebrun in her dancing frock and floating ribbons. I felt it, an incredible thing that I should be sitting here on terms of friendship with her cousin. "That's her picture, isn't it?" I asked suddenly. I could stand it no longer. I jumped to my feet and studied the photograph. "Yes, she's getting to be a beauty. She'll marry somebody with money, and her troubles will be over." It seemed to me astoundingly cold-blooded to parcel her off in such material fashion. "Do you mean that you would marry for money?" His cool, bright eyes met mine. "Why not?" "Well, a woman ought to love the man she marries." "She can love a rich man, can't she?" was his somewhat cynical rejoinder. "There was a Cinderella and the Prince. Most of the fairy tales are mercenary. It is rarely the poor lad who gets the girl." I had never thought of it that way. It had always seemed that poverty must find its compensation in romantic rewards. But when I analyzed it, I conceded that Lionel was right, and that most nursery tales ended in a blaze of diamonds for the heroine and trains of ermine. The idea depressed me. I'd hate to think that life is that way. What way? That money meant everything. Well, money means a lot, and the sooner you believe it, the better, Jerry. It was pleasant to have him call me by my first name. I had told him that I was named for my uncle, and he had asked, "Any French blood?" "We've a lot of Jeromes in our family." I had stammered a little over the statement that we were English. As a matter of fact, if we had a family tree, I did not know it. Yet I discovered afterward that our forebears were people of whom I need not be ashamed. They had not boasted of rank or title, but they had been men of education and of ideals, and there can be nothing better. I had told Lionel too that my uncle was rich and that I was his heir. I had tried to say it modestly, but I had liked the sound of it. "I am to have his ranch in Colorado." "You are in luck," Lionel had said, and then we had talked of other things. I was left, however, with the feeling that I had been a bit bombastic, and after that I was careful not to speak of what I conceived to be my glittering prospects. Yet I think Lionel let it be known among his friends what the future held for me. A good many of the men asked about my uncle's ranch. It seemed to give a sort of spectacular importance to my otherwise inconspicuous personality. It was then, I am sure, that the fiction of Uncle Jerry's ranch as a sort of shining palace took hold of my mind so strongly that it could only be shaken in those later days of disillusionment by the facts. I saw myself as the lord of great acres, surrounded by a retinue of dependents, in the midst of a cavalcade of galloping cowboys, lord of the manor, and, I must confess, in my wildest dreams, Mimi Lebrun sat by my side. In a way, this vision of my future gave me self-confidence, and the intimacy which grew up between Lionel and me increased my feeling of security. My belief in Lionel's talent was undoubtedly the thing which tied him to me. No one else would listen as I listened. No one else believed as I believed. I gave, and he accepted. Yet I know now that I should never have given in such great measure if around him and over him and all about him had not been the glamour of his relationship to the girl whom I had set so high in my thoughts. Our literary adventures became most exciting, for it was my adventure as well as his. My imagination often supplemented his skill, and he would stare at me and say, "Some day we'll write a play together. You have the sense of drama." We started a play, indeed, and worked late into the night, smoking cigarettes and putting much ink on paper. I'm sure my mother would have felt that my feet were in dangerous paths had she known of the tobacco we burned, but I felt very much a man of the world in my imagination of Lionel's modes and manners. I was adaptable, and Lionel advised me coolly, taking my need of advice for granted, and also my willingness to improve. "You've got to learn to dance, Jerry. You tangle up your feet too much when you walk." So I learned to dance. I learned, too, where and how to buy my clothes. I learned the catchwords and catchphrases of Lionel's set. These were, of course, the superficial things, but I learned more than that the kind of religion my father preached was unfashionable, and that high idealism was unfashionable. Lionel laughed at me for my cold-bloodedness where women were concerned. He could not know that it was not cold blood but dreams which kept me from the easy morals which went with the easy manners of my friend. And ridicule did not change me. I like to think that while I was weak in many ways, I was strong in this, and that when I looked into the clear eyes of the girl in the photograph on Lionel's table, I could meet them with a straight glance. The girl in the dancing frock with the floating ribbons was not, however, the vision that I treasured. The real Mimi was for me the girl with the russet hair, the dark irised eyes and the burnished peacock's feather whom I had seen in the small restaurant. I had brought back from college that fall a bunch of peacock feathers, having begged a half-dozen dropped plums from a neighbor of ours who kept one of the big birds. They reminded me of Mimi, and I stuck them in a vase in my room. Lionel, observing them, said, "They bring bad luck." I had heard this, but I did not believe it and said so. I like them. Queer thing, Mimi likes them too. She wears their colors. She had a costume once for a fancy dress affair, green and blue, with a great fan of peacock's feathers, and with her copper hair it was stunning. A famous artist painted her in it. My grandfather bought the picture, and now it belongs to his wife. She won't give it up. She's acting like a pig. Grandfather intended that Mimi should have it. He told her so 1,000 times, but Olga has the law on her side. She has grabbed everything and she holds on to it. Olga was, I learned, the step-grandmother. She was only 30 and had, of course, married the senator for the position he could give her. Would she sell the picture, do you think? Not to any of us. She's not our kind, and she knows we look down on her. His father made his money in hams and things, and she's only a second generation from social obscurity. But she's a beauty. That's what caught grandfather. And now she lives all alone, except for the servants, in her great house on Portland Place. This was a grievance on which he always waxed eloquent, so I got him back to the picture. Someone else might buy it for you. It appeared, however, that there wasn't money enough for a deal of that kind. Mimi's father had, it seemed, died when she was a baby. Her mother had lived until her father's death, on the allowance he had given her. Then the thing had stopped. I'd hate to have the picture go out of the family. The artist called it The Proud Lady, and it isn't just Mimi to me. It typifies all the women of our family, with their high-held heads. My heart felt like a stone in my breast. What had I to do with such women? My vague prospects for the future seemed at the moment cheap and tawdry. Mimi Lebrun knew men with millions. The old town where she lived was one in which great fortunes had been made. There was luxury and a scale of expenditure beyond my wildest dreams. Even my uncle's ranch seemed to shrink into nothingness. Yet, with youth's resiliency, I built new castles. Fame would carry me far. "Lion," I asked, "when are we to get to work on that play?" He caught at the idea with avidity. We burned much midnight oil. We rigged up a toy theatre and used pins for actors. We fancied ourselves incipient shows, pineros in the making. My spirits were at top-notch. Here was something to lay some day at the feet of Mimi Lebrun. 2. It was in midwinter that Lionel had a letter from Mimi. They kept up a desultory correspondence, and now and then he read a line or two to me. But this letter became mine to keep. I have it now, and so can give it, word for word, as she wrote it in her modish, angular script, on sheet after sheet of paper headed with a crest. Lionel read it to me because I happened to be in his room when it was handed to him. "Poor old Mimi," he said, when he had finished. "She's been having it out with Olga." He laughed and leaned back in his chair. "Listen, Cherry, and see if it wouldn't make a scene in a play." I may as well confess that I trembled as he read. It was like her own voice speaking. She wrote very naturally and unaffectedly, and she poured out her heart to him. "You see, Lion, I had to put pride in my pocket. I am to make my debut next fall, and we have to plan ahead. Mother said that I should only be asking for what was mine if I went to Olga, and that grandfather's heart would have been broken if he had known that I was to have my coming-out party in any other house but his. I don't want to have it there. The darling Papins have offered, and the Dana Clarks, but Mother won't hear of it. She says she came out in the Rose Ballroom, and that I must. I told her if grandfather had wanted me to have things, he should have made a will and said so, and then she cried and insisted that Olga had influenced him, and that he had thought she would do everything for us. Well, anyhow, I went. Olga has been having some alterations made in the house, and, oh, Lion, it is dreadful. The hall looks like the entrance to the Grand Opera House in Paris. Stairs sweeping up both ways, as they do on the stage, instead of the blessed old banisters that you and I used to slide down. She seemed glad to see me. I went in the afternoon, and she had tea for me. She has made grandfather's den over into a sort of Turkish retreat. It is puffy, with cushions of black and gold brocade, and she had on a tea gown of pale blue chiffon with sleeves like wings, and she looked like a plump blonde prima donna. I know I am prejudiced, Lion, but it was all so different in grandfather's day. She has had a balcony built at the end of the hall, and it overlooks a sort of wide foyer which leads into the ballroom, and there, as large as life and as lovely as the artist could make it, is my peacock portrait. Lionel laid down the letter. I can just see Mimi on that balcony, and Olga. You can't imagine two people more unlike, Jerry. I nodded. I was breathless with interest. The whole recital seemed like something out of a book. We leaned over the balcony, looking at the picture, and she said, in that slow way of hers, "One can't give too much wall space to the works of an artist like that." And I said, "Well, he had a good subject." She stood looking at the picture, and at last she said, "He makes you look older and handsomer than you are, Mimi, but not vainer." Can you beat that, Lion? I didn't know she had it in her, but I flung back, "There's a difference between vanity and pride." And she said, "But peacocks are vain, aren't they?" Well, I was simply furious, and I wanted to tell her so, but I wasn't there for that, so I simply said, "Well, I am glad he made me handsome, so that when I am old and ugly I can come back and look at it." We went back then to the Turkish retreat, and tea came, and I talked to her. I told her how Mother felt, and that I knew grandfather would have wanted it. And she said, "I think he would, and I will do everything to make it a success." And I said, "Thank you, Olga," and that seemed to be the end of it. But when we had finished our tea, she asked, "What are you going to do after that?" And I said, "After what?" And she said, "After your coming-out party." And I said, "Oh, I shan't have to do much entertaining. Our friends will help out." And she said, "I don't mean that. What are you going to do when you've made your debut and had a winter of dances and parties?" And I laughed and said, "I suppose I'll get married." She sat looking at me, and do you know, Lion, she gave me a queer feeling as if I were glass and transparent, and somehow I felt small and mercenary and frightfully frivolous, until I suddenly remembered that it is she who is mercenary and small-minded and unfair to you and to Mother and to me. So I stood up and said stiffly, "I am sure it would have pleased Grandfather to know that I am to have the rose ballroom." And she said, "I am sure it would please him, but you mustn't expect too much of me, Mimi." Lion, I felt utterly frozen when she said that, and I got out as quickly as I could and cried right in the street and had to hold up my muff so that people wouldn't see me. And when I got home, Mother wasn't there. She had gone to Aunt Bernice's to play bridge. And so I am writing to you, or I shall simply expire from suppressed emotion. Oh, Lion, I loved Grandfather, and it hurts and hurts and hurts to think he could have treated me like this. I was so proud of him, and the last time we were in Washington I was so happy. Oh, I wonder if I am ever going to be happy again. It ended there, and I was torn by her distress. To think that she suffered. Lionel took it easily. Oh, well, Mimi got what she wanted, so why should she care? But I felt that she should care, and indeed, when I had time to think of it all in colder blood, I wondered that she could ever have asked a favor at the hands of such a woman. I contrasted the sturdy pride of my own people, which would have led us to work our fingers to the bone rather than receive help from one who gave it grudgingly. We called Olga after that the ogre. We decided to put her in our play. She was to be the villainess and was to be overthrown in the end. No chance of that in real life, Lionel said, but we can do as we please on paper. He answered the letter, and it lay for a long time in a basket on his table. At last I carried it off. It was such a treasure, with its thin crested paper and its cry for happiness. I knew that Lionel would not miss it, and that if he did, he would think it lost. I should not confess my theft to him. 3. It was in June of that year that the miracle happened. I call it a miracle because it seemed nothing less than that to me. I was invited to spend a month with Lionel Clark at his step-grandmother's camp in the Maine woods. Mimi will be there, and her cousin Bernice, Lionel told me. Olga says in her letter that I may ask any fellow who will fit in, and it seems to me it will be a great chance for us to finish the play. At first glance, his reason for asking me might have seemed selfish, but I am sure it was more than the play which made him want me above all others. Our intimacy of the winter had knit us more closely together than either of us realized at the time, although we were to know it in the years to come. In spite of our utter differences in training, we were alike in this, that we soared to the skies when the mood was on us. We touched the stars. There was no limit to our aspirations. I expected the invitation with avidity. I could not, however, understand Lionel's willingness and Mimi's to be under such obligations. I hinted as much one night to Lionel. "It seems to me I'd rather starve." He shrugged his shoulders. "After all, in a sense it is ours, and we've always been to Grandfather's camp in summer." Mimi wrote that Olga had been rather decent. "She has brought me a lot of new clothes, and she is entertaining a large party of my friends and yours, Lionel. Mother won't go. She says it would remind her too much of the old days. So she and Aunt Bernice will stay with the Barrys at their place on Lake Michigan." Aunt Bernice was, I learned, a sister of Mimi's father. Her husband was a doctor of excellent standing, and it was her daughter, Bernice Barry, who was to go with Mimi to the camp in Maine. I wrote to my father that I would not come home in July, but would be with them in August. I had spent all of my summers hitherto at the parsonage, and I felt I had earned a chance of seeing. Yet my mother was not well. and I was sorry to be away from her. She had been failing for several years and had lost her old energy of body and of spirit. She leaned on my father. He did much of the housework, even cooking a meal now and then, and when I was there I helped him. The previous summer there had been too a strong young woman, Rose Drury, who came in when a feminine hand was needed for such work as canning fruit or getting up special meals for visiting clergy. Rose were buxom and red-cheeked, and in contrast my mother's paleness and frailty had been appallingly apparent. I wrote that I wanted them to have Rose regularly, and I would pay her wages. I have saved something from my allowance, and there had been an extra gift of money from Uncle Jerry. In all my years at college, I had not seen Uncle Jerry. I wrote to him regularly, and now and then he replied. He spoke of me always quite grandiloquently as his heir, and his letters had always that dashing effect which was so much a part of his personality. He was never, it seemed, long in one spot. His letters came to me from Texas and from Arizona, from Alaska and the South Sea Islands. I wondered why he did not stay on his ranch, yet envied him his opportunity to travel. My father was, I think, sorry I did not come straight home. He wrote that he hoped I would not prolong my stay in Maine. My mother was yearning to see me. Her disappointment was keen. I would have given up much for both of them, but I could not give up this chance of meeting Mimi. But I insisted they must have Rose Drury, and I sent them a check. As the time approached for our journey, I was tense with excitement. I was afraid, yet not afraid, to meet Mimi. I was afraid because I was sure I could never measure up in any way to the men among whom she moved. I was not afraid because I felt that fate could not be so cruel as to separate our futures. Lionel advised me as to the things I should need. A belted jacket and knickerbockers for everyday wear, and white flannels for evening. It was not, Lionel said, the custom to dress in camp, but there might be motor rides which would take us into more formal atmospheres. Automobiles had come by this time into rather common use among people of means, but I had no friends who owned them, and in the country horses were still the main dependence of the farmer. My father would not indeed have exchanged his old mare for anything run by gasoline. My idea of a camp was, I must confess, based somewhat on my own experience in the camps where my father and I had fished and hunted. Remembering the poetry of those nights under the stars, beside the perfume-swept pool, it seemed to me that my meeting with Mimi Lebrun could have no more perfect setting. I was not prepared, therefore, for the luxury of the place to which we came after a 30-mile motor ride from the train. The house was low and long, built of logs with the bark on, and back of it stretched primeval forest of pine and tamarack, of spruce and fir, fringed at the edge of the cleared spaces with a lighter growth of white birches, juniper, and oak. Stately, mysterious, the great evergreens reached toward the sky, and in that enchanted forest I was to walk with Mimi, talk with her. I was overwhelmed by the thought of it. When we arrived, rather late in the afternoon, at the great log house, there was no one in sight on the porches. We entered and found a blazing fire, for in spite of the sunshine the day was cool. In front of the fire, in a big chair over which was thrown a black bearskin, sat a woman, stiff-corseted and imposing. Her blonde hair was swept up into a curled pompadour. Her cheeks were pink, and her rose and white beauty seemed to stand out from the shadows as if painted on canvas. It was not until Lionel spoke, however, that I realized this was Olga, the ogre who had stolen his inheritance and the inheritance of Mimi Lebrun. Olga welcomed me graciously, giving me her hand when I was presented, and telling the man who had brought in our bags to serve us some refreshment. "The girls hoped to be here when you came," she said, "but a party rode over from the Stanleys' camp and insisted that they should go fishing. Mimi left a word for you, Lionel, that you were to ride over to the lake and meet them." "Are they on horseback?" "Yes, Drake can tell you the road they took." We went to our rooms and got into riding clothes. The house was lovely, spreading out so that all the rooms were on one floor. The furnishings were in keeping with the wildness of the surroundings, but preeminently comfortable. In the great living room where Olga had sat, the heads of animals decorated the walls, moose and deer and elk, and the mantel was made of a huge log split lengthwise and supported by rough-hewn blocks of granite. The bedrooms were bright with Indian rugs and Indian blankets, and sweet with the fragrance of bay and cedar. There was a bath with its water piped down from the lake. I felt my pulses pounding. It seemed to me that at any moment the masquerade might end and I should find myself back in the parsonage, milking the cow or washing dishes for my mother. Yet I was uplifted and eager in anticipation of my meeting with Mimi, and I chatted quite freely and confidently with Olga when we went back to the living room to have tea and sandwiches in front of the roaring fire. Our hostess talked to us of our trip. I knew at once that she was not at ease with Lionel, and his manner to her held a touch of half insolence which I resented. He was a guest in her house, and it seemed to me he should have remembered it. When he had finished our repast, we mounted our horses and started out to meet the others. Lionel knew the way, and our horses took the road at a good pace. We came to the lake to find a dozen people gathered in a gay canoes and on a low, long pier which ran out into the lake. They shouted when they saw us, and one of the girls detached herself from the rest and ran to meet us. She had a scarlet handkerchief bound about her head so that I could not see her hair, but I felt that it must be Mimi, and I was assailed by a sort of dizziness. Then I heard Lionel saying, "Bernice, bless your heart, old girl, but I'm glad to see you." As she came up to him, he lifted her to his saddle-bow and kissed her. She was a little thing, with dark flashing eyes and an oval, olive-tinted face. "This is Jerome Chandler," Lionel said, "familiarly known as Jerry." She swung herself up to my saddle-bow as she had swung herself up to Lionel's. "Shall I kiss him too?" she asked, and I was aware of the invitation of her lips and eyes, as years ago I had been aware of it in the lips and eyes of Theresa. Well, I accepted the challenge. No man could, I am sure, have done it differently without creating an awkward situation. Yet I hated it, although I carried it off as easily as any. But I had come a night riding to his lady, and I felt that this dark sprite had stolen something which I had treasured for another. "Where's Mimi?" Lionel demanded. "She went on ahead to meet you." "We must have missed her." "Oh well, we are all going back in a minute," Bernice said. "We caught loads of fish, and we are dying for our dinner." "Olga gave us something to eat when we arrived," Lionel told her. "She's a great old bird, isn't she? Dressed up to the nines in a place like this." "She isn't bad," Bernice stated. "She was never chaperoned, and so she gives us a loose rein. We break all the rules, and we've had some high jinks." I don't know what I had expected of Lionel's friends, but I am perfectly sure that I had not expected this. a daring siren who asked for kisses, and a crowd who broke the rules. Some of the others came up just then, and Lionel and I dismounted. I was presented to everybody, and they seemed to talk all at once. I smiled and said little. There was indeed little to say. They talked a language which was unknown to me. I should, I think, have felt crude, uncomfortable, in the midst of them, if my mind had not flown beyond them to my meeting with Mimi. She filled my thoughts to the exclusion of self-consciousness, so that I looked on with a feeling of detachment at the picturesque group gathered by the lake, as if I were audience and they the colorful chorus of some comic opera. As we rode back, Bernice was beside me. "Why didn't Lionel tell me you were so good-looking?" "Perhaps he wanted to keep it as a surprise." She flashed her dark eyes at me. "He should have given us warning." We laughed together, and I began to feel at ease with her. "Lionel says you are from New York. I adore it. When I die, it will be my heaven." "I am not from New York City. My home is in the western part of the state." "Oh, really?" She swept on from that to, "Lionel says you are writing a play." "He is writing it." "He says that he turns all of the love scenes over to you." "Well, he does." "Have you had so much practice in real life?" "I haven't had any." "You needn't tell me that." Her slanting glance was provocative. I was repelled by her manner, yet I was not a prig nor a prude. I was merely a romantic boy, holding fast to my worship of one woman. I was, too, impatient. I wanted to spur my horse on and on until I found her whom I sought. She belonged to this world of golden shadows and of waving branches. I felt she must be different from all the rest, that if she were like Bernice, I should die. Presently Lionel rode back to talk to Bernice, and I gradually dropped behind. I did not want to mingle with that comic opera crowd. From the viewpoint of today, my youthful arrogance is astounding. They were not so shallow as they seemed, nor was I indeed so serious. I turned my horse to the right and was presently riding under the great trees, parallel to the road but away from it. Here was no sunlight, but rather a faint greenish illumination, shading off into a sheen of amethyst, where a pool lay quiet among the deeper shadows, unearthly as a mirage, shining as a steel blade. To my exalted state of mind, the forest seemed a place of real enchantment. I should not have been startled if before me had arisen some dryad whom I might pursue fawn-like through the dim aisles. My horse, walking on pine needles, made no sound. No bird note broke the stillness. From far off came the dull beat of hoofs, as our party galloped gaily towards home. There was too the faint echo of laughing voices, and then, at last, as I loitered, silence. And something in that silence and loveliness seemed to beat against my heart, so that I was half suffocated by it, and I found myself all at once worshipping beauty as my father had worshipped. I stopped my horse and bared my head, and I seemed to hear my father saying, "God made it." Though I did not know it then, that moment was the last in which I looked out upon the world with a boy's enraptured gaze. A turn of the road, as one might say, brought me to man's estate. I have often wondered how my life would have tended if the message had come to me that morning, which arrived 10 days later and took me back to the farm. End of chapter 2. From the novel Peacock Feathers by Temple Bailey. Thank you for listening.